Falcha, welcome back. This is part 5 of the Sign and the Seal, which apparently the simpler a title is, the less well I can remember it from 1 minute to the next. So we're right about ready to read about Herodotus and what he had to say. So, what did he have to say here? So, Herodotus in the 5th century said that Egypt has more wonders in it than any country in the world and more works that are beyond description than anything else. Amongst other achievements, this widely traveled Greek historian, whose books are still in print, rightly credited the Egyptians with being the first of mankind to invent the year, to make 12 divisions of the season for it. Herodotus also claims to have penetrated some of the mysteries of the Egyptian priesthood, but then rather tantalizingly added that he could not or would not reveal what he had learned. So there's occult lost knowledge of Egypt that's universally accepted by mainstream historians. They know that the Egyptians were really into magic and secrets, and a lot of this knowledge has apparently been lost. So maybe Moses used this to build the ark. Maybe he knew something the rest of us don't know. The Egyptians had remarkable abilities, and they had unbelievable dexterity with gold jewelry making. For example, their metalwork was incredible, and their ability to make intricate gold jewelry has been remarked upon. They had copper edges on some of their weapons and utensils that could cut rock, but how did they get them that hard? Nobody knows. They were mathematically extremely sophisticated. They knew enormous amounts about astronomy. They could calculate longitude and latitude to an accuracy that was not equaled again for 4,000 years. Their knowledge of medicine and specifically surgery was remarkable. They knew a ton about the nervous system, and in the Middle Ages they didn't even have toilets in Europe, and thousands of years previously they knew brain surgery. They knew a lot about pharmacology. Modern archaeology tends to downplay all this because they can't explain it, so they minimize it. But the reality is the Egyptians had knowledge. No one knows where they got it, how they got it. It begs to be researched, I believe. Joseph Farrell is trying. Hancock says that after going and seeing some of this stuff, going and seeing what the Egyptians had, going to the museum in Cairo. I mean, when I saw the exhibit of Ramses, they actually had, I'm sure it wasn't the real thing, but they had walls with the inside of tombs, with the hieroglyphics and the story. Like they had passages from the Book of the Dead on the walls. And what struck me just mind-boggling was the precision and the meticulous way in which these things were done. You could see very faintly in the background sometimes lines that had been very lightly done, and then they changed their mind because it wasn't accurate enough, and they did it slightly differently. And you could see aborted first attempts and how meticulous, I mean, like they were professional. Who are those people who draw blueprints like that? Just absolutely perfect. So anyway, Hancock says that he was just astounded in the same way looking at it. And he notes that their sense of harmony and power and awe that's inspired by their stuff is just palpable. That the architecture is just not equaled anywhere except for, interestingly enough, Gothic cathedrals. There is some sort of a feeling of power, he said, when you go into an Egyptian piece of architecture, and the only other place you can sense it is in these Gothic cathedrals. Interesting. He says the obelisks reverberate and that perhaps sound had something to do with the power that was involved. And they could have built these obelisks with stacks of rocks, but they didn't. They used a particular kind of stone that was floated down the Nile from 200 kilometers away and did it out of long pieces of stone. And interestingly enough, there are reliefs on some of these buildings of the Egyptians that show the pharaoh lifting giant stones, just like making them lift up off the ground. And maybe has one small rope, but he's able to make it lift. It's been suggested that they were obsessed with the idea of balance and may have been using techniques of mechanical physics that are unknown to us, and therefore like magic, because when you don't understand it, it's like magic. And it said, oh, okay, I won't read that. I'm trying to save you the boring parts. There aren't too many. It's hard. Judiciously editing this for time, and it's difficult. So Hancock paid bribes to enter the Great Pyramid alone when he was in Egypt. And he went all the way up. I mean, I would never do this. I don't really have claustrophobia, but I must, because the idea of going into this thing all by myself and going all the way to the top is just all that stone. Oh. So he got to the room at the end of inside the pyramid, the king's chamber, and he says it occupied the very heart of the pyramid. It consisted of 9 monolithic blocks of granite, each weighing approximately 50 tons. He says, I do not remember how long I remained in the chamber. The atmosphere was musty and the air warm like the exhalation of some giant beast. The silence that surrounded me seemed absolute, all-enveloping and dense. At some point, for a reason that I cannot explain, I moved to the middle of the floor and gave voice to a sustained, low-pitched tone like the song of the fallen obelisk at Karnak. He had reverberated an obelisk. He had whacked it, put his ear to it and whacked it. And then he repeated this sound inside this pyramid. The walls and ceilings seemed to collect the sound, to gather it and amplify it, and then to project it back at me so that I could sense the returning vibrations through my feet and scalp and skin. I felt electrified and energized, excited, and at the same time calm, as though I stood on the brink of some tremendous and absolutely inevitable revelation. So he says that, wait a second here, let me change the page. Okay, the single large edifice of this pyramid was the single largest edifice ever constructed by man. The conventional belief amongst archaeologists was that it had been designed purely and simply as a tomb. This conjecture, however, struck me as being utterly incomprehensible. No mummy of any pharaoh had ever been found there. It's important to remember. I have argued this with people before, and they don't believe me, but they didn't find mummies. They found stuff. They found sarcophagi, but they never found a mummy in this tomb of Cheops. No mummy of Pharaoh had been found there, only a poor and undecorated sarcophagus of the so-called king's chamber. Was lidless and completely empty when it was brought to light by Caliph al-Mamun, an Arab ruler of Egypt who broke in with a party of diggers in the 9th century A.D. One U.S. critic pointed out that it's possible to marshal numbers to prove almost anything. And if a suitable unit of, as far as like the pyramid being magical numbers, the suitable unit of measurement is used, an exact equivalent to the distance to Timbuktu is certain to be found in the number of street lamps on Bond Street, or the specific gravity of mud, or the mean weight of adult goldfish. This, of course, is quite true, nevertheless, because we tend to see patterns. Nevertheless, I could see that there were certain surprising features to which the pyramidologists persistently drew attention, which did seem unlikely to be accidental. For example, it was a fact that the latitude and longitude lines that intersected at the Great Pyramid crossed more dry land than any others. This put the edifice at the very center of the habitable world. Likewise, it was a fact that when a north-facing quadrant, a cake-sliced shaped quarter circle, was drawn on a map with its axis at the pyramid, then this quadrant exactly encapsulated the entire Nile Delta. Finally, it was a fact that all the pyramids at Giza were precisely aligned to the cardinal points north, south, east, and west. It was, I thought, extremely difficult to explain how this particular feat of surveying could have been achieved so long before the supposed date of the invention of the compass. Just true facts. It's the pyramidologists, Orthodox scholars kind of, it's not that big of a deal. And then pyramidologists who are really into the pyramids see signs and prophecies in it. And what have I got here? Generally speaking, this Danish engineering guy says, I believe it would demand the combined genius of Cyrus and Alexander the Great and a Julius Caesar with a Napoleon and a Wellington thrown in for good measure to organize the armies required for carrying out the work of building the pyramid as it happened. But you remember, we've done a book on that too. So the Japanese tried to copy by building their own pyramid and using modern building materials, heavy lifting, cranes, etc., and they had to give up. They couldn't do it. They couldn't replicate it. So did something similar to the Ark exert some kind of power that helped to build the pyramid? We don't know. So chapter 13, the treasures of darkness. A myth says the Egyptians know that that knowledge came from Thoth. That's the hardest god's name to say. Thoth, who is the moon god. And he's often shown as an ibis, or a man with an ibis head, or as a baboon in Egyptian art. He was a lunar deity. He guarded the moon and created its cycles. And therefore, he was given credit for measuring time. He calibrated the seasons. And according to the priests at Hermopolis, Thoth was a demiurge who created the world with his voice. He spoke the word. Isn't that the first sentence in Genesis? Let there be light. So Thoth could bestow wisdom on individuals. He had hidden his knowledge on tens of thousands of scrolls all over the world, globally, to be found by people who were worthy to use for the benefit of all mankind. He's the equivalent of the Greek god Hermes, and he is as old as Egypt. There is no time in which Thoth did not exist in Egyptian theology, mythology. Thoth is credited with inventing drawing, writing, sciences, architecture, math, surveying, geometry, astronomy, medicine, and surgery. He was a most powerful sorcerer. He wrote the greatest book of magic and gave priests the understanding of the occult. He wrote much of the Book of the Dead. He wrote all of the sacred literature of Egypt, and he had a monopoly on sacred learning. He was called, his title was the Mysterious and the Unknown. The Egyptians believed that their first rulers were all gods. Now, this is a very Sumerian belief. Thoth reigned 3,276 years before, I'm sorry, I got it backwards. I'm doing that again. Before Thoth, 3,226 years before him, Osiris ruled. And when I say that there was never a time when he wasn't in mythology, I mean that they always believed this story. And Osiris is sometimes described as his brother and sometimes as the same entity. So there's some conflation there. He's associated with the celestial judgment hall where souls are weighed on great scales. The Egyptians believed when you died, your soul was weighed, good or bad. And Osiris was the arbiter and Thoth was the scribe. but sometimes the roles are reversed. So both gods are gods of the moon, gods of the dead, gods of judging and the law. They were, like Moses, civilizing heroes. They bestowed law, religion, and social order. Osiris brought social order and returned to heaven, leaving an advanced and sophisticated Egypt, having given architecture and a code of laws, or Thoth did. Were they a metaphor, or did somebody come down here and do that and then fly back to their homeland? We don't know. So Hancock discovered that it's accepted that Egypt arose in a very advanced state. They cannot find a history of development, of an evolution of the Egyptian culture. One day it wasn't there, and the next day suddenly they were there with this advanced culture, with a system of writing. Their skills in architecture and math and everything seemed to just be there from the beginning. Remains before 3600 BC, there was nothing about Egypt, and suddenly up pops this fully developed culture with hieroglyphics and very complex and detailed numerical symbols and advanced cursive script. No trace of an evolution of any of this, and it's true for all their knowledge: math, medicine, astronomy, everything. Even their religion, the Book of the Dead, seemed to pop up out of nowhere. At a period approximately, and this is from a professor of Egyptology at the University of London. This is not out of whole cloth, these beliefs. At a period approximately 3,400 years before Christ, a great change took place in Egypt, and the country passed rapidly from a state of Neolithic culture with a complex tribal character to a well-organized monarchy. And at the same time, writing appears, monumental architecture, arts and crafts developed to an astonishing degree, and all the evidence points to the existence of a luxurious civilization. All this was achieved within a comparatively short period of time, for there appears to be little or no background to these fundamental developments in writing and architecture. It's just incredible. And this is mainstream history / archaeology. This is not us looking for conspiracies, looking for the aliens. It's just true. So what was the common ancient source? Because a lot of this is very similar to Sumer. Was there a link? The impression we get is of an indirect connection and perhaps the existence of a third party whose influence spread to both the Euphrates and the Nile. Modern scholars have tended to ignore the possibility of immigration to both regions from the same hypothetical and as yet undiscovered area. However, a third party whose cultural achievements were passed on independently to Egypt and Mesopotamia would best explain the common features and fundamental differences between the two civilizations. The similarity between the two gods is too close to be accidental. It would be wrong to say that the Egyptians borrowed from the Sumerians or the Sumerians from the Egyptians, but it may be submitted that the literati of both peoples borrowed their theological systems from some common but exceedingly ancient source. So we have two choices. There was a third party that came before, from which they simultaneously derived on the earth, or this knowledge came from someplace else, and it's intriguing to debate that issue. Hancock did some research and he found an account that fit this whole belief, and he says he apologizes and said, I'm afraid that we're going to have to use the A word, Atlantis. And it had become such a popular sort of historical meme, to use the phrase anachronistically, that it was professional suicide, he said, to take the story of Atlantis seriously, especially at the time that he's speaking of in the 80s and 90s. I don't know what prevailing attitudes are today. This book is 40 years old. Holds up pretty well, though. And I don't know what the attitude would be today. It would be interesting to see what what discoveries have been made, because I bet they found some things. So anyway, Hancock discovered that Plato in the 4th century BC said that the source of a lot of his knowledge was an Egyptian priest. He spoke of recurrent destructions of civilizations by floods. Thousands of years before, the priest said, there was an island opposite the strait which you call the Pillars of Hercules, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. From it, travelers could in those days reach the other islands, and from them, the whole opposite continent, which surrounds what can truly be called the ocean. On this island of Atlantis had arisen a powerful and remarkable dynasty of kings. Their wealth was greater than that possessed of any previous dynasty, or likely to be accumulated by any later, and they were provided with everything they could require. Because of the extent of their power, they received many imports, but for most of their needs the island itself provided. It had mineral resources from which were mined both solid materials and metals, including one metal which survives today only in name, but was then mined in quantities in a number of localities in the island, aurichalk, and in those days the most valuable metal, except gold. There was a plentiful supply of timber for structural purposes and every kind of animal, domesticated and wild, among them numerous elephants. For there was plenty of grazing for this largest and most voracious of beasts, as well as for all creatures whose habitat is marsh, swamp, and river, mountain, or plain. Besides all these, the earth bore freely of all the aromatic substances it bears today. There were cultivated crops, there were the fruits of trees. All these were produced by that sacred island, then still beneath the sun, in wonderful quality and profusion. This paradise was not to remain beneath the sun for much longer, however, because soon, to punish its inhabitants for wrongdoing and an overabundance of materialistic pride, there came earthquakes and floods of extraordinary violence, and in a single dreadful day and night the island of Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. So, Hancock didn't believe it was in the Atlantic, but he said there's some basis in fact in this. And later on he does another book, and I strongly recommend that other book. I'll have to look up the name of it. But his second wife, who was a photographer, and he learned underwater photography and they went all over the place, around India and Asia and Africa and North America, and photographed what could be described as underground underground ruins of something. And then the book talks about what they could be. So he thinks this may be a memory that was retained by Egyptian priests and then written down, and he wonders, are there any similar written memories in Mesopotamia, and discovered, yes, of course there are. He speculates that this lost society would be the common source for both Sumerian and Egyptian cultures. He believed it was equidistant from the Nile Delta and the Euphrates, which is why both of these cultures came from it. And it vanished, or it developed in both places. And he supposes that it was an advanced civilization, that it was flooded, that survivors went to both Egypt and Sumeria, that the priests preserved the knowledge and developed the religious culture to specifically preserve knowledge. And they protected what they knew with the mysteries of the religious rituals, and it was only passed on to initiates. Hancock found mythical traditions of civilization and civilizing heroes were being saved from the water were common. For example, Thoth created a flood to punish wickedness. He and Osiris ruled after the flood. Osiris was saved from water. He carried knowledge all over the world, and his evil brother-in-law Set tricked him on his return to climb into a box that was made specifically to only fit Osiris, but Osiris didn't know this and he climbed into it. He quickly was sealed up and set afloat on the Nile. Isis, his wife, found the box and hid it. Her evil brother, Set, had found it and opened it and cut Osiris's corpse into 14 pieces and scattered them over the land. Isis made a small papyrus boat, collected the pieces, and with the help of Thoth, they put back together Osiris, and he was resurrected, and then became the god of the underworld and of the dead. The important feature of the story for Hancock, why he mentions it, is that Osiris was a civilizer and a lawmaker. He was placed in a gold-lined wooden box. He was thrown in the water, the Nile. He was rescued by Isis in a small papyrus boat coated with bitumen and pitch. They are parallels to the story of Moses. And there are many such heroes. For example, Horus was killed by Titans and thrown into the Nile and saved by Isis. He learned physics and divination, and he benefited mankind. Sargon the Great from Mesopotamia has a similar story. He says, "My mother was a priestess. I did not know my father. The priestess, my mother, conceived me and gave birth to me in hiding. She placed me in a basket made of reeds and closed the lid with pitch. She put the basket in the river, which was not high. The river carried me away and brought me to Aki, who was a man responsible for libations, and Aki looked upon me with kindness and drew me from the river." Jonah was saved from the belly of the whale, saved from water. Noah, saved from water. Jesus, it came to pass, let's see, rather than an actual, okay, so now he's making a leap of logic. You can take this with a grain of salt. Rather than an actual rescue, the incident in question was wholly symbolic and took the form of the mysterious rite of baptism in the waters of the River Jordan. Jesus explained this was necessary for salvation, important word here. Except a man be born of water, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came down from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized of John in Jordan. And straightway coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opened, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from heaven saying, "Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So he was saying that this is symbolic of initiation into an enlightened cult whose founders were literally saved from water, and then this was reenacted. And after this, Jesus could do miracles exactly like the magic of the Egyptians. Many of the miracles that Jesus performed were replicas of the magic that Egyptian magicians knew. And you can read, I mean, if you dig around, which Hancock did, there were parallels. And so he's saying that the baptism of Jesus was a metaphor or an initiation rite into the occult knowledge. And he notes that in Egyptian tombs of highly placed people, often entire boats are dismantled and put in their tombs. Outside of the Great Pyramid of Giza, in a trench, they found in perfect condition, 4,500 years after it was built, a giant boat more than 142 feet long with a displacement of around 40 tons. Its design was particularly interesting, incorporating, in the opinion of Thor Heyerdahl, all the seagoing ship's characteristic properties, with prow and stern soaring upward, higher than in a Viking ship, to ride out the breakers and high seas, not to contend with the little ripples of the Nile. This was not for tooling up and down the Nile. Another expert felt that the careful and clever construction of this strange pyramid boat would have made it far more seaworthy craft than anything available to Columbus. Indeed, it would probably have had no difficulty sailing around the world. So, there's more. It was not clear to me, particularly since, as noted in the previous chapter, there was absolutely no indication that any pharaoh was ever interred within the Great Pyramid. Furthermore, the earliest funerary boats to be discovered in Egypt dated back to that mysterious period before the inception of the First Dynasty, when civilization and technology in the Nile Valley underwent a sudden and inexplicable transformation. Hancock, therefore found it difficult to resist the conclusion that the curious practice of boat burial was more likely to be linked to the well-established tradition of salvation from water than to any purely religious symbolism. Sturdy ocean-going vessels would have been of immense importance to a group of foreigners who had survived a flood and who had settled in Egypt after sailing away from the site of the cataclysm. Perhaps they or those who came after them had believed that the buried boats might one day be needed, not to enable reincarnated souls to navigate the heavens like celestial pleasure trippers, but instead to allow living individuals to escape once again from the scourge of some terrible deluge. Interesting thought. The high point of Egyptian culture was in the early part of it, the 3rd to the 5th dynasties, and after that it was all downhill. There's a place called the complex of Zoser, which was built by Imhotep, and it is most impressive, and it's definitely the high point of the culture. Imhotep was the image and likeness of Thoth. Moses also was compared to Thoth, sort of in a Judeo-Greek way, especially in the works of Artapanus, who this 2nd century BC Greek guy who gives Moses credit for scientific inventions. He was the architect of later Egyptian Senmouth, a later Egyptian. I can't read my writing. An architect of later Egypt, Senmouth, that's better, claimed that he was initiated into a secret wisdom tradition that had existed from the beginning of time, of which Moses was part. Hancock asked, did the Knights Templar have access to that kind of knowledge at the Temple of Solomon? Is this a continuous chain, a connection? They tapping into an ancient knowledge, some stuff that Moses knew and Imhotep and Senmut. Ancient Jewish traditions, the Ark contained the root of all knowledge. The distinctive gift of the cherubim, interestingly enough, was knowledge. The Templars admitted that they worshiped Baphomet, and a guy called Dr. Hugh Schoenfeld says that translated, Baphomet is the same as the Greek Sophia, and it means wisdom. So we're talking about metaphors here. The Egyptians worshipped Thoth, who was the god of wisdom. The Freemasons hold Thoth in a very high place for preserving knowledge, and he is the patron of Freemasonry. Copernicus claims that he got his knowledge from the Egyptians, especially from Thoth. Kepler, too, said that he was stealing the golden vessels of the Egyptians. Isaac Newton said the Egyptians knew the planets orbited the sun, that also binomial theorem and integral calculus, that light and gravity, all these ideas came from the Egyptians. He spent much of his life studying Hermetic and alchemical literature. 1/10 of Newton's library was about alchemy. He was obsessed about there being a secret message in the Old Testament and in John of the Bible. He learned Hebrew. He used the book of Ezekiel to draw the floor plan of the temple and believed that it was built as a cryptogram of the universe and it would reveal the mind of God. This is Isaac Newton who said this. Mid-20th century, a guy called John Maynard Keynes got Newton's private manuscripts in an auction. And he said Newton was not the first of the Age of Reason, the obviously shaken economist later told the Royal Society. Newton was the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the world with the same eyes as those that began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. He made a careful study, Keynes did, of the manuscripts and concluded significantly that Newton saw the whole universe and all that it is in it as a riddle, as a secret which could be read by applying pure thought to certain evidence, certain mystic clues which God had hid about the world to allow a sort of philosopher's treasure hunt to the esoteric brotherhood. He believed that these clues were to be found partly in the evidence of the heavens and in the constitution of the elements, but also partly in hidden papers and traditions handed down by the brethren in an unbroken chain back to the original cryptic revelation. That he had drawn not only upon his own genius, Newton, but also upon some very old and secret repository of wisdom. He had once stated quite explicitly, for instance, that the law of gravitation expounded in his Principia was not new, but rather had been known and fully understood in ancient times. He had arrived at it by decoding the sacred literature of past ages. On another occasion, he had described Thoth as a believer in the Copernican system. Before that, he had aligned himself with the German physician and alchemist Michael Mayer, who died in 1622, who had argued that throughout history all the true adepts of science had derived their knowledge from the Egyptian moon god. Always connected to outer space. Amongst many other curiosities, Keynes discovered that Newton had been struck by the fact that there was a general tradition of deluge amongst ancient peoples, and he had shown considerable interest in the biblical view that Noah was the common ancestor of all humanity. Moreover, despite his own devoutly held religious convictions, he seemed at times to have seen Christ as an especially gifted man and as an interpreter of God's master plan rather than as the literal Son of God. What I found most fascinating of all, however, was the really pivotal figure in Newton's theology and in his conception of early science had been none other than the prophet Moses, whom he regarded as an adept in the mysteries of the universe, a master of alchemy, and a witness to the double revelation of God as expressed in his word and in his works. Long centuries before our own enlightened era, Newton had believed Moses understood that matter consisted of atoms and that the atoms were hard, solid, and immutable. Gravity accrued to both atoms and to the bodies that they composed. Gravity was proportional to the quantity of matter in every body. And Newton had also regarded the account of creation presented in Genesis and attributed to Moses as an allegorical description of an alchemical process. Moses, the ancient theologue, describing and expressing most wonderful architecture of this great world, tells us that the Spirit of God moved upon the waters, which was an indigested chaos or mass created before by God. Okay, so that's the guy who got his hands on Newton's private writings. Very interesting. Does this imply the continuing existence over millennia of a clandestine sect or a cult that passed on exclusive wisdom from initiate to initiate? For example, Rabdas, a mathematician who lived in the city of Constantinople in the 12th century AD, was known to have used a method for deriving square roots that had existed only in ancient Egypt more than 2,000 years previously and that had not otherwise been employed elsewhere. Here and from where he had acquired this technique, how and from where he had acquired this technique was not easy to explain. Moses talked with God on Mount Sinai, and with thunder and fire and electrical storms and clouds of smoke. He got the blueprint of the ark from there, and the stones with the commandments. The ark was a monstrous instrument of fearful energy if mishandled or misused. Moses used sorcery, and that was the equivalent of science in that society, and use that knowledge that he was handed on the mountain to build the ark. What if Moses had the ability, and what would his motive have been? What was this all about? Was he hoping just to civilize the Israelites, who were an anarchic tribe of migrant laborers marooned in Egypt? We tend to romanticize or stereotype them. It's like reading. Now, don't take this the wrong way. I'm drawing a comparison here. It's like reading a fairy tale. You get these stereotyped images. The story becomes a series of symbols in your brain, sort of. And when we say the children of Israel, we tend to have a romantic notion of what that means. So what we're talking about is tribal people who were lost, literally and figuratively lost from their own culture, from their own roots. They had been slaves for a very long time, and they were in a foreign land. So was Moses's goal to provide them with the direction to return to a civilization? And did he know that they needed preparation for that? And that in order to get back to where they belonged and to face their foes in that area, their destination, he knew they needed education, training, and so he wandered. He knew where he was going. He wasn't lost. They were. But he deliberately led them around for 40 years, not taking well-known trade routes. There were well-known trade routes in this area. It wasn't the complete unknown. And they were wandering, and was that a strategy to buy time to get the Israelites in shape for the conquest of the Promised Land? They were not always cooperative. They were not always cohesive. He had to convince them with miracles often, and he'd get mad at them. The ark was like a portable miracle machine. He'd pull it out every time he needed to whip them all back into shape. Before the ark, Moses did tricks, turned water coming out of a rock, or he got them water from a stagnant pool, or food, manna from heaven. And after he had the ark, he just used its power to command their attention. On one fairly typical occasion, he used it to inflict a disfiguring skin condition on his sister Miriam because she had questioned his authority. The Bible calls the skin condition leprosy. When Miriam had been suitably chastened, however, her sores vanished. Since they had appeared in the first place immediately after she'd been exposed to the mysterious cloud that sometimes issued forth from between the two cherubim mounted on the ark's lid, it is most unlikely that they were actually caused by leprosy. Might they not rather have been induced by some chemical or other contaminant released from the ark itself? There's an example of 250 men who challenged Moses, and he was shocked that they had done that, and then he challenged them to prove their holiness. The challenge was accepted, and they took every man his censer and put fire in them and laid incense thereon and stood at the door of the tabernacle with Moses and Aaron. No sooner had this gathering taken place than the glory of Yahweh appeared. Then the deity supposedly gave his favorites a 3-second warning of what he was about to do. Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron. He said, "Stand apart from this assembly. I am going to destroy them here and now." And at this, the prophet and the high priest threw themselves face downward on the ground, and there came out a fire from the ark and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. Afterwards, the children of Israel spoke unto Moses, saying, "Behold, we die, we perish, we all perish. Whosoever cometh anything near unto the tabernacle of the Lord shall die. Shall we be consumed with dying?" They had, it seemed, learned a salutary lesson. So was Moses able to construct such a thing, create such a situation? Had he killed the overseer and fled to the desert for 40 years and learned the area so well, and he had lived in a settlement called Serabit at El Kadem, 50 miles from Mount Sinai. So Hancock decided to visit the ruins and saw stone tablets with ancient pre-Hebrew that had been found there. And it was an important mining center and a place of knowledge of metallurgy. So there was like a scientific community at this place that Moses was hanging out. Hancock drove to the foot of Mount Sinai to the church and the monastery that were still there. He speculated that was this the place that Moses actually created the ark, and its energy source was from his knowledge of the minerals in the area. Was he throwing together chemicals like one of those chemistry labs you got as a kid, and smoke, flames? It's thought that the Ten Commandments were written in two pieces, written on two pieces of a meteorite, and it's similar to the Grail stone that was said to have come down from heaven. There are a number of top biblical scholars that agree that many ancient cultures worshipped some sort of meteorite fragments. They said it's very odd to conceal stones with laws on them as they do with the Ark and the Testament, the Ten Commandments. Usually something like this would be publicly displayed. It's not outside the possibility that the Ark contained a meteorite with some energetic characteristics that made it radioactive. It's not outside the possibility. In the Bible, as soon as the Israelites reached Mount Sinai, Moses went up to talk with God. So, Thou shalt set bounds unto the people, God said, all about. Take heed to yourself that you do not go up into the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death. He must be stoned or shot down by arrows. He must not remain alive. So they were creating an exclusion zone right away. So Moses then spent 3 days up on top of the mountain. In the morning there were thunder and lightning and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled, and Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because Yahweh had descended on it in the form of fire. Like smoke from a furnace, that smoke went up. Come up with me on the mountain, Yahweh says, and stay there while I give you the stone tablets, the law and the commandments, which I have written. Moses went up to the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of Yahweh settled upon Mount Sinai for 6 days. The cloud covered it, and on the 7th day Yahweh called to Moses from inside the cloud. To the eyes of the sons of Israel, the glory of Yahweh seemed like a devouring fire on the mountaintop. Moses went right into the cloud. He went up the mountain and stayed there for 40 days and 40 nights. From this perspective, the devouring fire on the mountaintop that the Israelites had interpreted as the glory of Yahweh would really have been the infernal glow given off by whatever devices or chemical processes the prophet was using to achieve his objectives. And although this hypothesis sounds far-fetched, it's surely not more so than the strange information concerning the tablets of stone that is contained in the Old Testament, in the Mishnah, in the Midrash, in the Talmud, and in the most archaic Jewish legends. That they were made of sapphire-like stone, they were not more than 6 hands in length and as much in width, but were nevertheless enormously heavy. Though hard, they were also flexible, and they were transparent. This is all in these texts. It was upon these peculiar objects that the 10 Commandments were supposedly written by no lesser figure than Yahweh himself, as the Bible points out. When he had finished speaking with Moses on the mountain of Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. And Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, tablets inscribed on both sides, on the front and on the back. These tablets were the work of God, and the writing on them was God's writing. And Moses is up there working on these things for 40 days and 40 nights. And when he came down, he found everybody worshiping idols, and he freaked out, and he broke the tablets, and he executed 3,000 of these idol worshippers. Then he went up there for another 40 days and nights, and when he came down, the skin of his face shone. And this didn't happen the first time, but only the second time. So was he exposed to something just a little bit too much? Is that what's going on here? The skin on his face was radiant after speaking with Yahweh. When God handed the tablets to Moses, he seized them by the top third, whereas Moses took hold of the bottom third, but 1/3 remained open. So part of it was covered by Yahweh, part of it was covered by Moses, part of it was exposed, and it was in this way the divine radiance was shed upon Moses's face. So did he get burned by something? It's absolutely clear that something happened to him, that his appearance was so gruesome when he arrived in the camp that all the Israelites were afraid to come nigh him. To spare their feelings, he put a veil over his face, and ever afterwards, except when he was alone in his tent, he wore this veil. So he had something happen to his face. Does this not sound much less like the behavior of a man who has been touched by the radiance of God than of a man burned badly by some potent energy source? The lid of the ark was 9 inches thick of gold. Why was the clergy required to wear special garments to protect them when they approached the ark? Was that why? Why was the ark wrapped in cloth and leather? To prevent the carriers from dying of touching the ark, and some died anyway. Why did it give off sparks? 2 sons of Aaron died when struck down by the ark, and Moses ordered to have them buried, taken away quickly and buried far away. The quest for the ark is equal to the quest for knowledge, wisdom, and enlightenment. So was the ark a metaphor was it a symbol of knowledge, or is there some knowledge used to create the power of the ark? So now we're at part 5, Israel and Egypt, 1990. Where is the glory? Chapter 14, the glory is departed from Israel. October of 1990, Hancock is visiting Jerusalem. Oh, this is a remarkable story. He's at the Dome of the Rock, the original site of the Temple of Solomon. This area is holy to the Muslims, to the Jews, and to the Christians. Inside is the Shetiyah, the foundation stone of the world. The Jews believe it is the Holy of Holies floor for the ark to sit on. But it's also the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It was the Templar headquarters in 12th century AD. Parts of the Templar additions are still there. The original Temple of Solomon was built only to be a haven for the ark. That was the purpose of it. In 587 BC, the Babylonians destroyed it. In 537 BC, it was rebuilt as the second temple. In 70 AD, it was razed by the Romans, and in 638 AD, the Muslims built on that site the Dome of the Rock. Legends claimed that the ark was hidden under the rock in a labyrinth of rooms below it. Is that what the Templars were doing for 7 years, searching under there? Hancock wanted to be 100% sure that the only place the ark could be was in Ethiopia, so he had to eliminate every place else. Therefore, he had to look at Templar headquarters. So he went there to talk to scholars, and he would only go to Axum if they said that it was possible that the ark could be there. Solomon followed Yahweh's demands and housed the ark, in the temple. Hancock thinks that that this is because he feared the destructive power of the ark, that they were afraid of the ark. People, were getting boils and tumors all over the place when they got close to it. And they were the lucky ones, didn't get struck down dead by a pillar of fire. Solomon followed other gods. He wasn't specifically enamored of Yahweh, and he was iffy about Yahweh. Hancock says the temple felt more like a prison to contain the ark than a place of worship. It really wasn't meant as a place of worship. It was a place to keep it and guard it. So there's this Masonic tradition describing the builder of the ark, Hiram, or they call him Hiram Abuff. Blindfolded on the ground, the initiate, the Masonic initiate, here's the 3 murderers that decide to bury him in a pile of rubble until, I'm sorry, I skipped a little piece. Well, we've kind of talked about that before. It's about the angels guarding the ark. So anyway, to symbolize the burial of Hiram Abiff, the candidate is wrapped in a blanket and carried to the side of the room, and soon he hears bells strike 12 times and is carried from the rubble grave to a grave dug on the brow of a hill west of Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. He hears the murderers agree to mark his grave with a sprig of acacia and set out to escape to Ethiopia across the Red Sea. So here we have, in a very important initiation ceremony of the Masonic Freemason group, replication of Knights Templar belief, reiterating that the Ark was taken to Ethiopia. So Hiram, the guy who was the builder, he was the actual physical builder, you know. The king, of course, commissioned it. Hiram was considered the son of a widow, which is how the Grail hero is always described. Also, the Templars and the Freemasons talk about him and his murder, and it's memorialized in this ceremony that I read to you before. I should have read this. There's this coincidence in the initiation ceremony that an acacia is mentioned, which the Ark is supposedly made of, and that Ethiopia is where he fled. Also, the Bible says that Hiram built a gigantic sea. Now, he didn't build a sea. He built like a pool, a basin, and it was for rituals. Water rituals, like I said before, are significant in Ethiopia and in relationship to the Ark at all times, symbolic perhaps of a sacred lake. The Bible says that he built 2 pillars in the sanctuary, Joachim and Boaz, and they are important to Masonic rites. They're in the tarot cards. We'll see them. We'll again when we look at the cards. I'll try to remember Joachim and Boaz. Point out the two pillars. They hid inside those pillars secrets, records, and they include the Shamir, the magic stories of Moses from ancient Jews that were occulted. The Shamir may not be put in an iron vessel for safekeeping, nor in any metal vessel. It would burst such a receptacle asunder. It is kept wrapped up in a woolen cloth, and this in turn is placed in a lead basket filled with barley bran. With the destruction of the temple, the Shamir vanished. And it's a device that belonged to Moses, supposedly able to cut rock and diamonds. It was hidden in one of those pillars, Boaz and Joachim. Hancock researched all the attacks on the temple, and all the ancient documents that he could find that described attacks on the temple, none ever mentioned the Ark at all. Now, Jews fled from Babylonian captivity by Cyrus in 539. And on the building the second temple, 5 things were missing: the Ark with the cherubim and the gold top, the Ark cover, the tent-like cover, the celestial fire, and then 2 things called the and the Thummim, which were objects. Nobody knows exactly what they were. Joseph Farrell thinks they might have been communication devices. They were for divining. You would get messages from them. And the myths were that all this stuff was in an underground cavern. And one story from the book of the Maccabees said that Jeremiah hid all of it at Mount Nebo, where Moses had been. So Hancock, now this is the awful story. October 8th, 1990, he was walking to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he heard gunfire and screaming as he approached. A group of ultra-conservative Zionists, the Temple Mount Faithful, had marched to the temple with banners. And I don't remember this happening, but I didn't have a TV at the time. What I had was small children. I was oblivious of world events at the time. So they had these banners that said, "Temple Mount, the symbol of our people, is in the hands of our enemies." And their goal was to go to the dome and lay the cornerstone for the third temple. Well, they were met with 5,000 Arabs throwing stones at them. A riot ensued. 11 Israeli worshippers at the Wailing Wall, it's the last vestiges of the old temple, were hurt, and 8 Copts were hurt. 21 Arabs were shot dead, and 125 were injured. Excavations nearby were the ones that Hancock had hoped to visit, and they were all roped off in the chaos. And he saw many Palestinians in the area as he was walking and trying to get out of it. Ordinary innocent people minding their own business that were beaten and arrested just because they were Palestinian. Hancock wanted to find out, had Mount Nebo ever been archaeologically studied, dug up. There was too much resistance to any archaeology near the dome and the Wailing Wall. Christians and Muslims were suspicious of Israeli digging. The most resistant to the idea were Jewish religious authorities, who were afraid the impure archaeologists might find the ark and touch it, so they wouldn't let archaeologists dig. No excavating until the Messiah comes. Honestly, that's the truth. So all Jews are believed to be in ritual impurity from the destruction of the Second Temple until the coming of the Messiah, and no one's allowed to touch the ark. So eventually there were archaeological digs outside it, and no ark was found. There were no digs except for a guy called Parker in 1910, who was described as a lunatic looking for the ark. A Finnish mystic in 1906 wrote a paper about the ark, saying that there was a secret underground passage under the temple. And he managed to raise $200 million to go find it. A guy called Montague Brownlow Parker, who was 30, had contacts with British aristocracy. He raised $125,000, and he went in 1909, and he hired an Irish clairvoyant to help him. And there was terrible winter of flooding, and it destroyed their archaeological digs. And then, this is interesting because of the name, Baron Rothschild bought land right next door to the archaeological digs, so his physical presence could intimidate them, because he wanted them to stop. So Parker bribed Muslims who were guarding the mosque to let them dig inside and turn a blind eye. So the archaeologists dressed as Arabs and dug at night, and the clairvoyant helped them to know where to dig, but they were accidentally discovered by the mosque attendant, and they barely escaped with their lives to Jaffa and got on a boat. There were huge riots about all of this. The bribed Muslims were carried off by the mob. Rumor was that he had found the ark and took the ark to Jaffa, and the police caught them, but they had nothing. They didn't find it. They had nothing with them, and they were allowed to wait on their yacht for further notice from the police, and they just sailed away. And they returned home with nothing, including no money. And in the 1920s, so that was that debacle. In the 1920s, there was a claim of an American who dressed like an Arab and used a woman's name and claimed that he found a secret blocked chamber under Mount Nebo, that it had inscriptions that, translated by an anonymous scholar, said, "Herein lies the golden Ark of the Covenant." The next try was 1981 by a guy called Tom Kreutzer, an American who discovered the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, and the City of Adam, according to him. He flew to Mount Nebo and had no luck, and on top of Mount Nebo there's a monastery of Franciscans, the Franciscans of Terra Santa, who do their own diggings, and they guard the church. It's supposed to be the burial place of Moses. So this guy, Kreutzer, went to Mount Pisgah, and on October 31st of 81, he claimed to find a gully, which led to a passage, which led to a wall, which led to a crypt that had the poles that were used to carry the ark. And he claims to have taken photos, brought them back to the United States, and showed them to Rothschild. And he only would show them, wanted to show them to Rothschild because he was the direct descendant of Jesus Christ, chosen by the Lord to build the third temple. And Rothschild said, thank you, but no thank you. He wasn't interested. So Kreutzer kept the photos and he only showed them to special guests. And, hang on, there's a little tiny bit more here. A guy called Siegfried Horn, who was some sort of an expert, and he looked at them and he said, I don't know what the object was in the picture, but it convinced me this is not an ancient artifact, but a modern fabrication with machine-produced decorative strips and an underlying metal sheet. And Hancock said he was disconcerted to be preceded in his search only by messianic visionaries and harebrained cranks, and he feared the Ethiopian claims would be flimsy, and he decided to seek out a more solid source of somebody saying that it was in Ethiopia, something more reliable than the Kebra. So now I'm going to stop because we're at a new chapter, and let me see here how many more pages I have. Well, I'll have to do the math. I think I might have one more video left. If it's more than one, I'm not going to do it today. If it's only one, I'm going to do it today. So, fingers crossed, I guess, if you're enjoying this. Thank you for watching. I'm going to upload it, and I'll be back within the near future to finish it all. So, Slangefoil and Slancha.